Not all fashion is trying to be beautiful. Some of it is trying to be honest. Rick Owens understands that, which is why his work has never felt interested in pleasing everyone. It isn't built around comfort in the traditional sense, or familiarity, or trend. It's built around structure, around discipline, around the idea that clothing can become a way of shaping presence itself. And that's important because most people approach fashion as decoration, something external, something added. But Rick Owens approaches clothing almost architecturally as construction, as environment, as a system that changes how the body moves through space. That's why the silhouettes matter so much. The elongation, the layering, the repetition, nothing feels random. Even when the work appears raw, it's controlled, extremely controlled. And that control is part of the philosophy because Rick Owens doesn't create from excess. He creates from restriction, from limiting the palette, limiting the shapes, limiting the distractions. And through those limitations, the work becomes recognizable immediately. Not because it's loud, but because it's consistent. And consistency creates identity. That's one of the deepest lessons inside his work, not just creatively, but spiritually, because discipline itself can become a form of practice, a way of refining intention over time. And when you look at Rick Owens through that lens, the work starts to feel less like fashion and more like a philosophy being worn on the body, the system. One of the reasons Rick Owens became so influential is because he built an entire world around his perspective, not just garments, a complete visual language, the furniture, the spaces, the casting, the presentations, the materials. Everything speaks to the same internal logic, and that level of coherence is rare because most brands eventually begin chasing outside approval. But Owens stayed close to the system he created, even as fashion changed around him. That's why his work feels timeless to certain people, not because it ignores the present, but because it isn't dependent on it. The work doesn't need trends to validate it. It already knows what it is. And there's something deeply spiritual about that, not in a religious sense, in a disciplined sense, because building a consistent body of work over decades requires belief, not belief in hype, belief in vision, belief in restraint, belief in returning to the same questions over and over again until they become clearer. That's why repetition exists so strongly inside his work. The boots, the draping, the proportions, the monochromatic palette. People sometimes mistake repetition for limitation, but repetition can also be refinement, a way of going deeper instead of wider. And that's what separates Rick Owens from imitation. A lot of people copied the aesthetic. Very few understood the system behind it, because the aesthetic was never the point. The philosophy was. And once you understand that, the work changes. You stop looking at the garments as trends and start seeing them as expressions of a larger structure, a way of organizing identity through discipline. And that's why the work continues to resonate, not because it's trying to keep attention, but because it was built with enough clarity to sustain itself. Rick Owens also changed the conversation around the body, not by idealizing it, but by transforming how it occupies space. His work often exaggerates shape, broad shoulders, long silhouettes, heavy boots, layered forms, and through those choices, the body becomes almost monumental, not fragile, not decorative, architectural. And that shift matters because traditional fashion often tries to perfect the body. Rick Owens recontextualizes it instead, makes it feel ceremonial, powerful, sometimes even intimidating. And that emotional reaction is intentional because the work isn't asking for passive admiration. It's asking you to confront something, your relationship to identity, to masculinity, to beauty, to structure itself. And that's part of why the runway presentations became so important. They weren't simply shows, they felt ritualistic, processional, almost like performance art. Bodies moving in formation, garments functioning like armor, sound creating atmosphere, everything operating together, not just to display clothing, but to create immersion. And when fashion reaches that level, it stops functioning purely as product. It becomes world building. That's the real achievement, not creating a recognizable look, creating a recognizable reality, a complete emotional environment. And people respond to that because it offers coherence, a sense that someone truly understands their own language. And in a culture built on constant reinvention, that kind of clarity becomes magnetic. Structure as spiritual practice. And maybe that's the deepest thing inside Rick Owens's work. The understanding that structure itself can become grounding, that repetition can become meditation, that restraint can become identity, because a lot of people think freedom means unlimited options. But sometimes freedom comes from knowing exactly what belongs to you and staying committed to it. That's what Rick Owens represents, not chaos, not rebellion for its own sake, but controlled intensity, a life built through deliberate choices repeated over time. And you can feel that in the work. The consistency, the clarity, the refusal to dilute the vision, even after decades. That's rare, especially in fashion, because fashion often rewards novelty. But Rick Owens built influence through continuity, through deepening the same language instead of abandoning it. And that's why the work continues to matter. Not because it's trendy, but because it's rooted. Rooted in discipline, rooted in perspective, rooted in a way of seeing the world. And once a designer reaches that point, the clothing becomes more than clothing. It becomes philosophy, a way of organizing thought into form, a way of shaping identity physically, a way of moving through the world with intention. And that's why Rick Owens belongs in this conversation, not simply as a designer, but as someone who understood that fashion could become structure for the self, not decoration, structure. And that distinction changed everything.